This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 46 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, November 13th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford in 1909. This issue starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. and Mrs. William A. Woodward entertained very pleasantly a group of friends at whist last Friday evening. There were 3 tables for the game. Refreshments were served during the evening. A good number from Westford Grange attended the sessions of the Middlesex North Pomona Grange at Lowell last Friday. A good program of discussion, readings, music, and an address on farm law. In the evening, the 5th degree was conferred on a large class of candidates. The H.V. Hildreths were over Sunday guests of the Fred A. Hildreths at Malden this last week. Mr. and Mrs. Pearl Harmon have closed their Westford home. They lived at 73 Hildreth Street, which is on Hildreth near the Flag Road intersection. They have left Westford and gone to Florida for the cold months. They go to South Lake Weir, where Mr. and Mrs. Foss are located. The 9:30 electric Wednesday forenoon got derailed at the terminal, but after some strenuous work by the motorman and conductor and some others, the car resumed its regular trips, only missing one trip. Miss Ruth Fisher, principal of the Frost School, is ill at her home with diphtheria in the care of a trained nurse. The school was closed on Wednesday morning for the rest of the week to await any further developments. She was the daughter of Alvin Fisher, of a fairly large family of children, most of whom lived in Westford or in Lowell. Next paragraph is the Tadmont Club paragraph. The regular meeting of the Tadmont Club took place Tuesday afternoon in the vestry of the Congregational Church. There was a large attendance of the members and a number of guests to welcome Mrs. Helen H. Richards of Boston, whom the club claims as an old friend through her former association with Westford and also from her contributions to the club's program last season when she spoke on foods. Ellen H. Richards, her maiden name was Swallow. Her father, Peter Swallow, came to Westford and opened a general store about where the Westford Library driveway is now. And he came to Westford primarily so his daughter could attend Westford Academy. She was Ellen was a 1863 graduate of Westford Academy, and she was an instructor in sanitary chemistry at MIT and was a member of the first graduated class from Vassar. Before she worked at MIT, she was a chemist for the Massachusetts State Board of Health. She was the author of several books dealing with sanitation, with air, water, and food analysis, and with ventilation. She once said, quite modestly, "My work is only missionary. I merely teach others to go about the big things." Back to the article. This year, Ellen's topic was more general, pertaining to the general welfare of the home, treating many phases of the complexities and problems of modern living with characteristic keen insight and good sense. At the close of her address, a club tea was served by Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher, Miss Ida Layton, and Mrs. Frank C. Hildreth. The next section is the Grange section. The Grange last Thursday evening had a profitable and enjoyable program for its first meeting in November. At the business session, it was voted to hold a Farmers' Institute this winter, and Samuel L. Taylor was appointed to confer with the Committee on Institutes as to date, speaker, etc. A desire was expressed that George Albert Drew be invited to be the speaker for the occasion. He would become the founder of what we know as Drew Farms. The program for the evening was a lecture by E.H. Forbush, state ornithologist, illustrated with beautiful colored charts of our feathered friends. The speaker outlined the work of the state ornithologist as being the dissemination of all possible knowledge of birds. He spoke of the excellent literature on the subject to be had by applying to the State Board of Agriculture, and of the great value of birds to man, particularly the farmer. He did not like to have the crow and the blackbird maligned, and explained why. Professor Forbush showed himself to be a close student of our birds. He gave many facts about our game laws for the protection of birds, of work accomplished by the Audubon Society, of facts concerning the relation of sportsman and the milliner to the subject. His discourse was brightened with many anecdotes, and at the close questions were freely asked and answered. There's a paragraph on taxpayers. The total levy of taxes for the town of Westford this year is $30,468, with a rate of $15.70 on each $1,000 of evaluation. And this is followed by a list of all the taxpayers in town paying $50 or more. It goes on for a fairly long page. The next section is the About Town section, written by each week by Samuel L. Taylor. In the death of Daniel W. Harrington of Graniteville last Sunday, the village, town, and communities where he mingled have lost a temperately useful personality whose influence was always tabulated for righteousness. Nature had tempered him heavily laden with a genial, smiling greeting for the duties and friendships of life. It was strong and contagious. Sad as his sudden death, sadder yet that only 29 bright, rosy summers was he permitted to influence us, those genial, smiling friendships. We'll read another obituary of Dan Harrington shortly. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas E. Taylor of Woodsville, New Hampshire, made a half-dozen-hour visit to his old home, corner of Lowell and Stony Brook Roads. He is a veteran of the Civil War, as well as a veteran in service of the Boston and Maine Railroad. This is the house where Samuel L. Taylor lived, and Thomas Taylor was a half-brother of Samuel L. Taylor by their father, William Taylor's first wife. Samuel, I think, was born in 1849 and Thomas in 1847. The farm of John J. and Daniel H. Sheehan on Pigeon Hill was sold at auction last Saturday afternoon. This sale was to settle the estate, and Daniel H. Sheehan, who for several years has been the nominal proprietor, now becomes by this sale nominal and legal proprietor. Martha J. Taylor has arrived home after spending over a year with her uncle, Gilbert A. Schellinger, who owns a farm at Boundbrook, New Jersey. This is the homeland of peaches, poultry, and asparagus. Gilbert Schellinger was the brother of Samuel L. Taylor's wife. William R. Carver has bought of Joseph E. Knight the thrifty young orchard south of the buildings on the Chelmsford Road. Miss Frances Bannister has been ill with sore throat, which interfered with her duties as schoolteacher at Graniteville. Two of the children of Joseph Sears have been seriously ill of diphtheria at their home on the road near Westford Station and under quarantine. Next section is the Forge Village section. The members of the John Edwards Host Company will hold their first chicken supper at their club rooms Saturday evening. This is the first affair to be held by the firemen, and if the present plans are carried out, it will not be the last. Mr. and Mrs. Wilbert E. Parsons left on the noon train Tuesday for Rainier, Oregon, where they expect to spend the winter with Mrs. William Kennedy, a sister of Mr. Parsons. They went with the Judson tourist party by way of the Hoosick Tunnel and the Mohawk Valley, that's across New York State, to points further west. They expect to arrive at their destination Monday, November 14th. They will also spend some time in Southern California. The Hoosick Railroad Tunnel mentioned here runs for 4 3/4 miles under the Hoosick Mountain between the Deerfield River in Florida, Mass. On the east side and the Hoosick River in North Adams, Mass. On the west side. The first train passed through in 1875 after about 25 years of off and on construction and at the cost of 195 lives. I'm not sure what that was caused by, but I'm guessing it was a cave-in. A very pretty wedding occurred at St. Catherine's Church Tuesday morning, November 9th, when Miss Pamela LaFair, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gensia LaFair, was united in marriage to Joseph Gurapy, son of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Gurapy. Reverend E.T. Schofield officiating. Antonio Campanini, an Italian employed on the foundation of the new mill, which Abbott and Company are erecting, met with a very painful accident Monday morning. He was digging in a sandbank near the wool sorting room when it suddenly caved in, burying him up to his shoulders. His cries attracted his fellow workmen, who quickly went to his rescue. He was carried to his home close by, where Doctors Sherman and Wells attended him. He received a very severe spraining and will be unable to resume work for some time. The next section is called Musicale. Miss Sarah Precious held a very enjoyable musicale at her home Saturday, at which all the relatives of her pupils attended. She was assisted by Mrs. Creasy and Teresa Lowther and Rachel Cheney as vocalists. And then there was a program given of various numbers that were performed. Next is the obituary. It's on the death of Daniel W. Harrington. Daniel W. Harrington, a highly esteemed young man of this village, died at his home on 2nd Street early Sunday morning, November 7th, after an illness of only 5 days' duration, aged 29 years. Death was due to a cerebral hemorrhage caused from a stream of water from a hose while fighting fire at the barn of J.A. Healy that was burned on Monday night, November 1st. Mr. Harrington was rendered unconscious at the time, and although the very best medical attendance was given him, he never fully recovered from the shock, and death relieved all suffering early Sunday morning. He leaves a wife, Mrs. Hannah R. Harrington, one brother, P. Henry Harrington, who was a well-known building contractor in town, and 4 sisters, Miss Mary Harrington and Mrs. Henry J. Healy of this village, and Miss Catherine and Anna Harrington of Leominster, as well as numerous relatives in Lowell and Fitchburg. Seldom, if ever, has a death in this village aroused such heartfelt sympathy as is expressed by the entire community in the passing away of this popular young man. Dan Harrington, as he was familiarly called, was a friend of everybody and leaves a host of friends both here and in surrounding towns, where his position as salesman brought him in contact with many who can testify to his sterling, manly qualities. Being a big, jovial fellow with a pleasing personality, he was beloved by young and old who had the pleasure of his acquaintance, and his untimely death will be sincerely mourned by all. He was always interested in the village welfare, and ever ready to help a worthy cause. He was a devout member of St. Catherine's Church, having been one of the first altar boys selected to serve at Mass when the present church was dedicated. He was an honored member of Court Westford 170, Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters of America, a trustee of Court Granville 179, Foresters of America, a lieutenant of the A.R. Schote Hose Company, and a willing worker in the cause of temperance, being a member of St. Catherine's Temperance Society of this village. All of the above-named organizations held special meetings on Sunday afternoon when they took suitable action on the death of their fellow member and appointed committees on attending the funeral. I believe that Dan Harrington was the first Westford fireman to lose his life in the line of duty, and he's memorialized on the Fireman's Monument just outside of the town hall in the center of town. On Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, the members of Court Westford, headed by R.J. McCarthy, Chief Ranger, formed a line at Healy's Hall and marched in a body to the late home of the deceased. The funeral took place on Tuesday morning and was one of the largest attended funerals ever witnessed in this village. At 9 o'clock, the members of Court Westford, headed by R.J. McCarthy, assembled at Healy's Hall, where they formed in line and marched to the home of their deceased brother, where the prayers for the dead were recited. Shortly after, the members of Court Granville 179, Foresters of America, marched in a body from the hall to the home. Florence Sullivan, Chief Ranger, and his staff of officers, having their regalias draped mourning. At the house, Florence Sullivan read a farewell address to the bereaved family. The members of the Ayer-based Hose Company and the members of St. Catherine's Temperance Society were already present. The different societies and organizations lining each side of the street. When the family had taken leave of their loved one for the last time, the line of march for the funeral procession was formed. All marched to St. Catherine's Church, where the members of the Edward M. Abbott Hose Company of Westford and the John Edwards Hose Company of Ford's Village joined with the local fire company as a guard of honor over their deceased member. At 10 o'clock, a Requiem Mass was celebrated by the pastor, Reverend Edmund T. Schofield. At the conclusion of the Mass, the Reverend E.F. Schofield, E.T. Schofield, I believe that should be, said a few words on the past life of the deceased. His remarks made a deep impression, and when he finished, there was not a dry eye in the church. Never since the church has been built have so many people attended a funeral service of this kind. The church was filled to the doors, and many were obliged to stand during the service. During the day and Monday, by request of the teachers in the sergeant school, the flag on the school building was placed at half-mast out of respect for the deceased. Many school children attended the services at the church. The floral tributes were varied and beautiful, which testified in a marked degree to the high esteem in which the deceased was held. The bearers were James R. Healy, Charles McKenna, Edward Riney, Henry Leduc, J. Austin Healy, and R. J. Heeman. At the conclusion of the services in the church, the line of march was then formed and proceeded to St. Catherine's Cemetery. Reverend Edmund T. Schofield officiated at the grave. The following letter has been received from Captain Sherman H. Fletcher, Chief of the Westford Fire Department, addressed to Mrs. Daniel Harrington, widow of the deceased. Westford, Mass., November 8, 1909. Dear Mrs. Daniel Harrington, I am greatly shocked to hear of the death of your husband, of your beloved husband. Accept my most sincere sympathy in your bereavement. It is not only a loss to the fire department, but also to the community in which he lived. I trust you may be able to bear up bravely in your affliction, knowing that he was much respected by those who knew him. Very respectively, Sherman H. Fletcher, Chief, Westford Fire Department. Much gloom has settled over the village in the death of this well-known young man, and the different organizations of which the late Daniel W. Harrington was a member have suspended all forms of entertainment until the period of mourning is over. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending November 13th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.